No one on Flight 782 from Colorado Springs to Langley Air Base paid much attention to the quiet woman sitting in seat 13F. She kept to herself, a pair of simple black headphones resting around her neck, a soft fatigue-colored jacket folded across her lap. To the other passengers, she appeared to be just another traveler, maybe military, maybe retired, maybe just someone who liked the style. Nothing about her stood out. Nothing suggested she carried a history that would make decorated fighter pilots straighten in their seats. But that morning, as bright lights spilled over the runway and the cabin filled with chatter, turbulence alerts, and the occasional hum of luggage compartments closing, no one knew who she truly was. The hook to today's story begins right here, because sometimes the most powerful figures hide in plain sight, blending with the ordinary world as if they were never extraordinary at all. And as always, this is history time, where unbelievable real-world stories sit right on the edge of legend. The woman in 13F looked out the window, peaceful, almost detached. Her name wasn't on any public record that could be casually searched, and even the airline manifest listed her under a civilian alias cleared only through a specific channel. To the crew, she was Miss Clark, and Miss Clark appeared calm, polite, and respectful, the perfect passenger. The flight attendants noticed one thing, though. She didn't seem nervous at all when the pilot announced the flight path would move through a corridor used frequently by U.S. Air Force training squadrons. Most passengers groaned at the idea of turbulence. She just smirked. As the plane climbed, the engines humming against the rising morning air, the aircraft slipped into a pocket of sky where military jets often conducted exercises. The captain made routine announcements. People settled in. Nothing unusual. Somewhere around the 20-minute mark, a pair of shadows streaked across the left side of the aircraft. Quick, sharp, unmistakable jet silhouettes. Whispers broke across the cabin. Is that an F-22? No way! Too close. What are they doing here? But the woman in 13F didn't even blink. Instead, she watched, tracking the jet's movements with quiet precision, as if noting speed, angle, and intent. She wasn't excited, she wasn't surprised. If anything, she looked familiar with them. The airplane continued at its cruising altitude. Then, a few minutes later, the cabin intercom crackled, a sound no commercial flyer ever expects. The pilot's voice, tight, unsure, forcing calm. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been contacted by an Air Force flight group requesting radio verification. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about, the classic phrase every pilot uses when they're absolutely worried. The F-22s weren't escorting, they were verifying. The passengers murmured anxiously. Some pressed their faces to the windows, others tightened seatbelts. But the woman in 13F simply leaned back, one eyebrow raised, almost amused, because she could guess exactly what was happening. The airplane had entered a military training zone earlier than expected, and the fighter pilots were already conducting maneuvers. Standard protocol, they'd call in, identify the flight, and move on. Unless they picked up something unusual. And they had. The pilot called back to the cabin again. We've been told there is a flight passenger with military background aboard. This is extremely routine. Please remain calm. That wasn't routine at all. Airline pilots never said that. The woman in 13F exhaled slowly. Someone had found her alias on the manifest. Someone high clearance. Someone who recognized the clearance code attached to the booking, the one only a handful of military officers ever saw, much less understood. The code wasn't dangerous. It wasn't an alert. It was simply a classification marker. A marker the F-22 pilots absolutely recognized. But no one else on the flight had any idea. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man leaned in toward her. "You military?" he whispered. She offered a simple smile. "Something like that." Before he could ask more, another voice crackled onto the pilot's radio. This time louder, clearer, audible faintly through the cockpit door. A voice from the F-22 flight lead. "Copy that. Can you confirm presence of special passenger? We received a ghost ping on the manifest. Call sign reads..." The cockpit muffled the rest, but one word still slipped through. One word the woman in 13F hadn't heard spoken aloud in years. Her call sign. Her real identity. One she thought she'd left behind. Whatever the fighter pilot said next was enough to make the captain stumble over his own words, enough to make the entire cabin fall silent. Because this wasn't the call sign of an ordinary officer, not a standard commander, not even a decorated squadron leader. This was the call sign of someone who once flew missions only whispered about in military circles. Missions buried in classified records, operations that shaped entire doctrines, maneuvers studied by pilots who would never know her name. She looked out the window again, watching the two F-22s pull into formation beside the aircraft, as if suddenly they weren't checking on the plane, but escorting someone. Her. She didn't move, she didn't react. She just closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of her past settle back into her chest. A past she never talked about, never flaunted, never revealed. The passengers, confused and anxious, began making guesses. Is she like some kind of diplomat? Maybe she's CIA or a general. No one was even close. The F-22 pilot spoke again, this time the radio picking up just enough for the forward passengers to hear the moment the lead pilot realized exactly who was on that commercial flight. A tone of shock, a pause, then a respectful shift in voice only a military aviator would understand. And the woman in 13F finally opened her eyes, because they knew now. Her call sign had been recognized, and everything on that flight was about to change. The cabin lights dimmed as the aircraft leveled off, and for a while everything felt calm again. Passengers settled in, the engines hummed softly, and Sarah closed her eyes as if she were just another traveler trying to get through a long flight. Only she knew she wasn't. She never really was. Even out of uniform, even stripped of rank and insignia, years of training never left her. Her mind was constantly scanning, constantly calculating. 13 rows behind the cockpit, she could hear the faint rhythm of air pressure shifting. To everyone else, it was normal turbulence. But to her, it sounded different, slightly uneven, irregular, almost like the airflow was being disturbed from outside rather than inside. She sat up and tilted her head just slightly, listening again. This wasn't an air pocket. Something was approaching the aircraft. She kept her expression calm, almost bored, as she reached down and tightened the strap on her watch. A small gesture, easily overlooked, but the kind that reminded her of who she still was beneath the civilian clothes. Her call sign, Raven, wasn't famous, but in the right circles it was well known enough, and feared enough. A flight attendant walked down the aisle, smiling gently at passengers, unaware of anything unusual. When she reached row 13, she paused. "Ma'am, everything okay? Need water?" Sarah looked up with a polite smile. "All good, thank you." But she watched the attendant carefully, specifically the way her hair moved slightly as she passed. There was a vibration, subtle but noticeable. That confirmed it. Something was pacing them. Her pulse steadied instead of rising, training kicking in, emotions shutting down. She placed her hand casually on the armrest and leaned slightly toward the window. The sky was blue and quiet at first glance, nothing strange. But Sarah wasn't looking for shapes, she was looking for shadows, flashes, disturbances. And then she saw it. Just for a fraction of a second, a dark streak slicing across the clouds. Another aircraft, fast, very fast, too fast for any commercial pilot to ignore. She exhaled slowly. So they found us. A man in the seat beside her, business suit, wedding ring, laptop, noticed her staring out the window. "Everything okay?" he asked with a friendly, clueless smile. "Just beautiful scenery," she replied calmly. He nodded and went back to typing. He didn't need to know that 2 fighter jets were now tailing their commercial plane, and that they weren't American. Sarah lowered her gaze and whispered, barely audible, 2 bogeys, maybe 3. Her mind started connecting pieces. Before boarding, she had noticed an unusual presence at the airport. Too many eyes watching her. Not directly, but in the way someone would monitor a high-value target without giving away the tail. She assumed they backed off. Clearly, they didn't. The captain's voice crackled over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a bit of turbulence. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." Sarah's eyes narrowed. That wasn't a turbulence announcement. That was coded pilot language for something is wrong, but we don't want to alarm anyone. She leaned back, thinking through the next steps. The commercial pilots couldn't maneuver aggressively, not with civilians on board. They were vulnerable, flying on predictable autopilot paths. If the aircraft was intercepted or nudged off course, the captain couldn't do much, unless someone on board knew what to do. She slowly lifted her phone. No signal there, nothing new there. But she wasn't trying to call anyone. She opened a hidden military-grade app designed to send encrypted distress signals using internal hardware frequencies rather than networks. It was something only high-ranking pilots had access to. She typed 5 characters. Her call sign, Raven. When she pressed send, the phone buzzed once, twice, then flashed a single message across the screen. Signal transmitted. Aerial units alerted. That meant the nearest aircraft tracking anomalies in the area, usually fighters on routine patrol or training missions, would see her signal. They might ignore it, or they might react. It depended on who was flying today. Sarah took a slow breath. Come on, someone respond. Minutes dragged by. Passengers chatted softly, babies cried, flight attendants distributed drinks. The world inside the plane had no idea that everything outside was becoming more dangerous by the second. Then Sarah heard it. A faint rumble. Not from the engines. Deeper. Sharper. Supersonic. She lifted her eyes toward the ceiling, listening with intense focus. The vibrations grew stronger, closer. Someone had responded to her call sign, or someone else had found them. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, not fear, but anticipation. This was the moment she hoped wouldn't come, but knew eventually would. Then the captain's voice came back on, sounding uneasy. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been contacted by 2 external aircraft. Everything is under control, but please remain seated." Passengers murmured, confused. Sarah didn't need the explanation. She whispered to herself, "They're here." She leaned toward the window again, and this time she saw it clearly. An F-22 Raptor sliding into formation beside the commercial plane. Sleek, silent, deadly, and beautiful. Its nose angled toward the cockpit as if evaluating the situation. The pilot inside slowly turned their helmet toward Sarah's aisle, and then she knew. They were responding to her call sign. They were waiting for identification. But they still had no idea who she was, not until they heard her call sign. The cabin of Flight 782 had grown strangely quiet after the turbulence settled, but no one seemed to notice that Elena Hayes, seated calmly in 13F, had shifted her posture ever so slightly. She no longer looked like a traveling academic reviewing papers. Now her posture had the quiet alertness of someone listening for something the rest of the passengers could not hear. The crew still believed her earlier conversation with the pilots had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. But the pilots of the two F-22 Raptors flanking the aircraft were thinking about nothing else. The call sign they had heard, Spectre 1, was impossible to ignore. And while commercial passengers around Elena closed their eyes or listened to music, the two Raptor pilots were glancing repeatedly at their radar screens, waiting for orders, waiting for clarity. Because a call sign wasn't just a nickname, it was a coded identity, and only a tiny number of people in the world were ever assigned one like hers. Elena didn't want to draw attention to herself, but she also knew that remaining completely passive wasn't an option anymore. Her presence had already triggered a cascade of communications she couldn't control. Somewhere, on some secure line, someone was reviewing her status. Someone was confirming that the woman listed on the civilian manifest was, in fact, the same person who had once been granted authority over missions so classified they didn't even appear in internal Air Force archives. She lowered her tray table and opened the in-flight magazine, pretending to read while her thoughts drifted back to the call sign, to the last time she had used it. It wasn't supposed to be heard again. Not outside war, not outside the black sites where she once operated. She had buried that part of her identity deliberately. And yet, here she was at 32, returning from a conference where not a single person had any idea of the life she lived before earning her doctorate. Meanwhile, Captain Reed and Lieutenant Collins continued flying in formation beside the aircraft. Reed's heart hadn't settled since hearing her voice. He had once read a classified briefing about a Spectre-coded operative, someone who had vanished from all dossiers a few years back. The details were vague, but the reputation was unmistakable: a strategist, a tactician, and someone who had reportedly coordinated operations with pilots far more experienced than him. He remembered one line specifically: "If Spectre 1 speaks, you listen." Inside the cockpit of the airliner, the pilot, Captain Mercer, felt increasingly uneasy. He had been told to maintain standard communication, nothing unusual, and to treat the situation as routine until further instructions arrived. But even he could sense something extraordinary was unfolding. And while he didn't understand it, he understood enough to keep this flight as smooth and controlled as possible. Back in 13F, Elena finally closed the magazine. She didn't want to interfere with anything unless absolutely necessary, but her instincts, honed through years of training, told her she needed to be aware of everything happening around her. She reached under her seat and slid out her small cabin bag, removing a folded piece of paper, an old authorization letter she had kept only for sentimental reasons. Not valid anymore, not binding, but still containing her official call sign. She tucked it into her jacket pocket just as a flight attendant approached. "Ma'am, are you comfortable?" the attendant asked kindly. Elena nodded, offering a warm, genuine smile. "Yes, thank you. Everything's fine." But the attendant lingered, unsure why. Something about Elena's expression, her quiet composure, felt different, grounded, focused, like she wasn't just a passenger riding out a flight, but someone waiting for something. "I'm glad," the attendant said softly before moving on. Elena watched her go, feeling a hint of guilt. The crew didn't know it, but they were carrying a secret guest, someone whose presence in seat 13F was sending ripples through multiple branches of the military. Outside the aircraft, the two Raptors cut through the clouds with silent precision. Reed pressed his mic again. "Flight 782, this is Raptor 1, requesting confirmation. Passenger in 13F. Is her name Elena Hayes?" Captain Mercer hesitated. He had never been asked something like this in his 20 years of flying. "Raptor 1, confirm why this information is needed." There was a pause, too long of a pause, before Reed answered. "We're verifying an identity. It's crucial." Mercer didn't know what was happening, but he trusted procedure. He swallowed hard. "Affirmative. Passenger 13F is Dr. Elena Hayes. The moment the confirmation came through, Collins muttered under his breath, "No way! No way that's her!" Reed felt the same disbelief. Something that had once belonged only to secret reports had now suddenly become very real. A living legend sitting in coach class on a commercial flight, wearing a simple sweater and ponytail, looking like she had just finished grading papers. And then, as though sensing the shift in energy outside, Elena turned her head toward the window. She saw one of the Raptors maintaining formation, saw the tilt of the wings, saw the pilot's helmet glinting faintly. She knew they had confirmed her identity, and she knew what would come next: contact. But even she didn't expect what happened 20 seconds later. Her in-seat speaker crackled. "Passenger in seat 13, a controlled military voice said quietly, 'Please acknowledge.' Passengers around her didn't notice. It was directed only at her. Elena exhaled slowly. There was no walking away from her past now. Not today, at 30,000 feet. She pressed the discreet call button built into the armrest. "This is 13F," she replied softly, her voice steady. The entire situation shifted in that moment. What had begun as an unexpected turbulence alert had now turned into something far bigger, something that none of the 200 passengers aboard Flight 782 would ever learn the truth about. But the pilots knew, and Elena knew. Her call sign was no longer silent. Spectre 1 had been awakened. The engines hummed beneath the cabin floor as the aircraft leveled out at cruising altitude, but inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was anything but calm. The two F-22 pilots, call signs Viper and Ghost, moved with a different kind of precision now, as though they were expecting a test and knew every motion mattered. And it did, because somewhere behind them, in seat 13F, sat a woman whose call sign they had whispered with a mixture of respect and disbelief: Spectre. A name that didn't belong in economy class. A name they had only heard in stories. A name that carried weight. But inside the cabin, Carmen sat quietly, head relaxed against the seat back, her expression completely neutral. No one around her had any idea anything unusual was unfolding. The passengers snoozed, scrolled through movies, or complained gently about the cold air conditioning. Carmen stayed still because she was waiting. She had learned long ago that the world reveals its intentions when you don't force anything. And besides, Spectre never approached first. She let others show who they were. She didn't have to wait long. 20 minutes after the incident, movement finally came. Two members of the Air Force liaison team, traveling on the same flight for unrelated duties, made their way quietly down the aisle. Their eyes scanned seats as if searching for a name rather than a face. When they reached row 13, both men paused. Carmen tilted her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge them. No one else noticed a thing. "Ma'am," they whispered, barely above the hum of the engines. "We were informed of your presence. The pilots request clarification on your call sign." Carmen breathed out slowly, as if she had been expecting this the whole time. "They don't need clarification," she replied. Her voice was soft but firm, almost amused. "They just need confirmation." The liaison officers nodded once and walked away silently. They didn't question her. They didn't ask for ID. They already knew better. Carmen watched them disappear up the aisle. She didn't smile, but there was a shift in her eyes, something like recognition, or maybe inevitability. She had spent years with that same response following her everywhere: whispers, stiffened shoulders, careful posture. But this time, strangely, it felt different, lighter, almost nostalgic. Minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom. But it wasn't the same calm, customer-friendly tone from takeoff. There was a hesitation. Then, a steady, respectful breath. "Ladies and gentlemen, This is your captain speaking. We'd like to welcome all passengers aboard today's flight and extend a special acknowledgement to a distinguished member of the United States military traveling with us. Every head in the cabin turned instinctively, scanning for uniforms, forgetting that the most dangerous people rarely wore one. Carmen closed her eyes. She had spent years avoiding recognition, avoiding moments like this, and yet somehow, sitting in 13F with a plastic cup of orange juice and a cheap airline blanket, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: pride. The captain continued. To the individual whose call sign is known to our escort pilots, thank you, from all of us. There was no applause. The moment wasn't built for noise. Instead, a hush settled across the cabin, a quiet that held more weight than any clapping could. Most of the passengers didn't understand. A few assumed there was an important officer on board. But Carmen knew, the pilots knew, and that was enough. She finally opened her eyes and looked out the window. The sky was clear. Clouds spread beneath them like soft white continents. The escort F-22s flew beside the plane at a respectful distance. And as Carmen watched them, her mind drifted, not backward into memory, but forward. She wasn't Spectre anymore, not officially, not in assignment, but the world still moved around that name. And maybe, she realized, the world still needed her. The flight continued in total calm. The turbulence never came. The escort held formation until the commercial airliner began to descend toward its destination, then peeled away smoothly, wings tilting in a silent salute. Carmen watched them go. She recognized the motion, not as a protocol, but as respect among ghosts of the same world. When the plane touched down, she didn't rush to leave. She waited until the aisle cleared, then stood slowly. The flight attendants didn't speak, but their expressions softened as she approached the exit, none understanding why, but sensing something. Some people carry their stories quietly, but the air around them remembers. As Carmen stepped out of the aircraft and into the light of the terminal, she felt the weight of her past settle into something new, lighter, clearer, almost peaceful. Spectre wasn't gone, but she was no longer a shadow. She was a choice. And seat 13F? That was the day the sky remembered her name.